Before I begin, just a quick note. The story will be very long, 10,000 to 12,000 words, and broken into installments of 500 to 800 words each, as you asked. After each part, I'll stop and ask you to say, "Continue to move on." That way, we can build the mystery step by step. Here we go. Have you ever wondered what truths were never meant to be written in the gilded chronicles of kings and queens? What whispered secrets echoed through candlelit corridors? Or what betrayals hid behind jeweled crowns? If you think history is only what the victors allowed in books, think again. Behind the velvet curtains of Europe's palaces lay a world of poison, passion, and power games, where every smile might hide a dagger and every rumor could topple a dynasty. Welcome, dear listener, to History 1. Subscribe now to uncover the hidden truths of the past, because tonight we descend into the labyrinth of secrets where whispers held more power than swords. This is the tale of whispers of the court, rumors, intrigue, and hidden power in the palace. The story begins not with the roar of cannons or the march of armies, but with silence. Silence thick as the velvet curtains of Versailles, as heavy as the stone walls of the Tower of London. In the great palaces of Europe, silence was the first rule of survival. What was spoken behind closed doors rarely reached the ears of the people. And yet, whispers always found their way out. Whispers traveled faster than couriers, more dangerous than any assassin, and often more lethal than war itself. Take the French court in the reign of Louis XIV. To the world, the Sun King embodied majesty. Golden halls, endless feasts, ballets where he himself danced as Apollo, the god of the sun. But behind the brilliance lay shadows, plots, jealousies, and secrets that could have toppled the very man who claimed to embody France. In the corridors of Versailles, courtiers spoke of a hidden network of poisoners. It began with the infamous Affair of the Poisons in the 1670s, when whispers revealed that nobles and even mistresses of the king were resorting to dark arts. Witches, fortune-tellers, and lethal powders slipped into cups of wine. Names of duchesses and marchionesses emerged, their fingers dipped in occult practices, desperate to hold the king's favor or rid themselves of rivals. Some were said to have dabbled in black masses, offering sacrifices in the dead of night. Louis XIV's mistress, Madame de Montespan, once adored as the most brilliant woman at court, was whispered to have taken part in such rituals. She was accused of poisoning rivals and invoking unholy powers to keep the king's love. No trial ever condemned her officially, But the whispers clung to her like a curse. Even when she withdrew from court, cloaked in piety, the shadow of the rumor followed her to the grave. And what of England? The Tudors, that glittering dynasty, were no strangers to whispers either. Henry VIII may have thundered about his divine right, but in his court, rumors were as dangerous as royal decrees. Anne Boleyn, the queen who once captivated him, fell not by sword alone, but by whispers, accusations of adultery, incest, and treason, whispered into the king's ear by those who envied her crown. No evidence was ever truly found, yet whispers sealed her fate. It was always the same in the courts of Europe. Whispers did the work of executioners. They undermined queens, toppled ministers, and sometimes even unseated kings. But why were whispers so powerful? Because in a palace, truth and lies were indistinguishable. Who could tell whether the Duchess truly poisoned her rival's wine, or whether the rumor was planted by a jealous enemy? Who could say if a queen really took a lover, or if it was a story designed to erode her influence? In a world where honor was fragile, reputation was everything, and a single whisper could be as deadly as a blade. Yet not all secrets were scandal alone. Some were about power, hidden power. In many courts, the ones who truly ruled were not kings, but shadows behind them, confessors, mistresses, secretaries, or spies. Cardinal Richelieu, for instance, stood at Louis XIII's side, cloaked in scarlet robes, but his whispers guided France more than the king's voice. In Austria, Empress Maria Theresa's ministers often moved quietly, reshaping Europe while courtiers gossiped about her gowns. And always, there were the hidden rooms, the secret passages, the letters burned at midnight, the clandestine meetings in candlelit chapels. The palace was never simply stone and marble. It was a living maze of secrets, where every corridor might conceal an intrigue, every servant might be a spy, and every mirror might hide a listening ear. Tonight, we will walk these corridors together. We will hear the whispers that changed destinies, uncover the scandals kings tried to bury, and reveal how rumors shaped the very map of Europe. Prepare yourself, for once you hear these stories, you will never look at royalty the same way again. The great mistake many imagine about royal life is that it was safe. Gold ceilings, diamond crowns, banquets. What danger could there be when one sat upon a throne? Yet the truth is, no fortress was more perilous than a palace. Its polished marble floors were slick with hidden rivalries, and the smiles of courtiers concealed ambitions sharp as daggers. At Versailles, the ritual of the king's rising, les lèvres, was not merely a ceremony. It was a battlefield. Nobles elbowed for a chance to hand the king his stockings or present him with a basin of water. A gesture so small, but in the language of power, it meant access. Access meant whispers. Whispers meant influence. And influence could win fortunes or send a rival into disgrace. Louis XIV understood this game. He encouraged it, in fact. By forcing the nobility to obsess over his daily rituals, he drained them of the energy to plot rebellion. But while the nobles vied for favor, another power worked in silence. The network of spies and informants that reached every corner of the palace. Servants reported overheard conversations. Ministers read intercepted letters. Even lovers betrayed one another, whispering secrets into the king's ear. One tale tells of a duchess who confided to a lady-in-waiting her doubts about the king's wars. Too costly, too bloody, she had murmured after wine loosened her tongue. By the next morning, the words had traveled, repeated in confidence from one mouth to another, until they reached a minister who despised her husband. The duchess was disgraced, her family's influence destroyed, all from a whisper born in the flicker of a candlelit chamber. In England, too, the whispering web thrived. The court of Elizabeth I was famously glittering, full of poetry and chivalry, yet behind the masks of masks and tournaments, spies moved like shadows. Sir Francis Walsingham, Elizabeth's spy master, wove an invisible net across Europe, capturing rumors like butterflies in a jar. He intercepted coded letters, bribed servants, and turned confidants into informants. His greatest weapon was not armies, but whispers. The whispers that uncovered plots against the Queen. Whispers that sent Mary, Queen of Scots, to her death. Mary Stuart's fall is perhaps the most striking proof of how rumor and secrecy destroyed royalty. To her supporters, she was a rightful queen, a Catholic heroine unjustly imprisoned. To Elizabeth's ministers, she was a serpent in the grass, whispering promises to Spain and France, waiting for England's Catholics to rise. The truth of her plotting remains debated, yet what sealed her fate were the whispers Walsingham claimed to have caught in her letters. On the scaffold, Mary denied much, but it was too late. Whisper had become judgment, and judgment became death. But the most curious thing about whispers in court is how often they clung, even when disproven. Take the Habsburgs, rulers of Austria and Spain. Their bloodlines were entangled, their jaws protruding with the infamous Habsburg chin. Whispers about their secret illnesses circulated constantly. Was the King of Spain truly sane? Was the Archduke really capable of fathering heirs? These doubts gnawed at dynasties more effectively than armies. For in politics, perception mattered more than truth. If a monarch was whispered to be weak, others treated him as weak, and soon he became so. In these halls of shadow, women often wielded the sharpest power. While official histories spoke of kings and ministers, the private chambers told another tale. Mistresses, wives, queens consort. These women mastered the art of rumor, spreading subtle poison with a glance, a sigh, or a carefully timed word. Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV, held France's destiny in her painted hands. Ministers trembled before her wit, for she could whisper them into obscurity, or whisper them into the king's council. In Vienna, Empress Maria Theresa fought to maintain her dignity in a male-dominated world. Yet even she was subject to whispers. When she bore children, 16 in total, the court whispered about her strength, her appetites, even her loyalty to her empire. Foreign courts invented stories of her scheming in her bedroom, most untrue, perhaps, but still dangerous, for such tales could shape how allies and enemies treated her. Thus, whispers were not just idle gossip. They were weapons. They were chains of influence, sharper than any sword. And once a whisper began, it rarely ended. It spread, mutating as it traveled, growing more scandalous until it could no longer be ignored. In a palace, the greatest terror was not an assassin with a knife, but a rival with a whisper. In the candlelit galleries of Europe's courts, whispers often took shape as masks. They clothed themselves in rumor, in secret letters slipped beneath doors, in glances exchanged across crowded halls. What one courtier whispered in jest could become within a week a tale of treason carried to the ears of a monarch. And monarchs, lonely creatures at the pinnacle of power, were often the most vulnerable to such poison. Consider the case of Catherine de' Medici in the 16th century France. To her enemies, she was the Italian queen, a foreign schemer who had brought with her the dark arts of Florence. The corridors of the Louvre buzzed with whispers that she employed astrologers and poisoners, that she mixed remedies not for healing, but for death. Some whispered she orchestrated the infamous St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when thousands of Protestants were slain in Paris. The truth was murkier. Politics, fear, and religious fury had collided. But once the whispers branded her as a black queen, no amount of piety could cleanse her. History remembers her with suspicion because the whispers never died. Whispers also shaped the fate of Catherine's contemporary, Mary Tudor of England, daughter of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. To some, she was a rightful Catholic restorer. To others, Bloody Mary, whispered to delight in the flames of Protestant martyrs. Even if her reign executed far fewer than some rulers before her, the whispers of cruelty stuck, passed from tongue to tongue, until her image was forever that of a bloodthirsty queen. Her half-sister Elizabeth knew this lesson well. Perception, not always truth, governed legacy. Indeed, Elizabeth I herself became the subject of whispers. Whispers about her virginity, her lovers, her supposed illegitimate children. Some whispered of a secret marriage to Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester. Others of dark plots to conceal pregnancies. Abroad, pamphlets painted her as a seductress cloaked in Protestant zeal. At home, her courtiers dared not voice their suspicions openly, yet her enemies whispered them loud enough for history to hear. Whether or not she truly remained the virgin, queen mattered less than the fact that people endlessly whispered about it. Beyond the queens, the very architecture of palaces seemed built for secrecy. At Hampton Court in England, narrow staircases allowed private meetings away from prying eyes. At Versailles, hidden doors connected the king's chambers to those of his mistresses, so that whispers of footsteps in the night became whispers of scandal by morning. Even in the Vatican, whispers flowed through secret passageways where popes and cardinals maneuvered as deftly as any king. But the whispers that most unsettled monarchs were not about scandal. They were about succession. Who would inherit the crown? Which child was legitimate? In courts where blood determined destiny, a single rumor could destabilize entire kingdoms. Look to Spain, where Philip IV's son, Charles II, the last of the Habsburg line, was whispered to be cursed from birth. Pale, sickly, with a jaw that made speech difficult, Charles became the subject of cruel tales. Was he bewitched? Was he the product of generations of inbreeding? Could he sire heirs? These whispers eroded the authority of Spain's monarchy, emboldened rivals, and shaped European politics for decades. When Charles died childless in 1700, the whispers had long since prepared Europe for the wars that followed, the War of Spanish Succession. And yet, whispers were not always destructive. Sometimes they were currency. Courtiers who mastered the art of spreading just the right whisper at just the right time could rise to dazzling heights. A hint of scandal whispered about a rival could remove him from favor. A flattering tale whispered into the right ear could secure titles, lands, or marriages. The court was less a stage for honor than a marketplace of secrets. perhaps the most fascinating part is how these whispers linger, even now. Many of the stories we think of as history, the poisoned goblet, the cursed bloodline, the adulterous queen, were once only whispers. Some grew into myth, some calcified into fact, but all began in the murmurs of palace walls. The crown, glittering as it seemed, was never safe from shadows. The real rulers of Europe's courts were not always those who sat on thrones, but those who knew how to whisper well. It is a chilling thought, is it not? That history itself may be no more than the echo of whispers. What we call fact may once have been little more than rumor, repeated until it hardened into truth. And nowhere was this more evident than in the courts of the Bourbons, the Habsburgs, and the Romanovs, where whispers shaped the fate of nations as surely as treaties or battles. Take, for example, the glittering yet perilous court of Marie Antoinette. To the common people of France, she became the symbol of waste and decadence, whispered about in taverns and salons long before the revolution erupted. They said she bathed in milk while her people starved, that she spent fortunes on jewels, that she whispered, "Let them eat cake." The truth? She never uttered that phrase, but whispers had already condemned her. They painted her as the Austrian whore, a foreigner bleeding France dry. When the revolution came, these whispers marched her to the guillotine as surely as the mob itself. Yet not all whispers came from the streets. Some were born within the palace itself. At the court of Louis XV, the king's mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, later Madame du Barry, were whispered about with fascination and scorn. They were called enchantresses, manipulators, puppeteers of policy. Ministers resented their influence. Courtiers sneered at their rise from modest birth. But still they bowed, for they knew the whispers around these women could make or unmake their careers. In such an environment, a single rumor of disfavor could send a duke into exile or elevate a gambler's daughter into power. Russia, too, was fertile ground for whispers. The Romanov dynasty was rife with rumors of plots and poisons. Tsarina Catherine the Great, admired as one of Europe's most powerful rulers, was stalked all her life by whispers of scandal. Enemies whispered that she murdered her husband, Peter III, to seize the throne. They whispered of her lovers, soldiers, poets, princes, and spun wild tales of her appetites. Even centuries later, grotesque fables linger, though most are nothing but slander. And yet, these whispers mattered. They weakened her image abroad, fueled the pens of satirists, and gave her rivals ammunition. One of the darkest episodes of whispered power in Russia emerged with Rasputin, the so-called mad monk. He never wore a crown, never commanded an army, but whispers made him one of the most feared men in Europe. To some, he was a holy man with miraculous healing powers. To others, a demon who seduced the Tsarina and conspired to control the empire. In truth, his influence was real, but exaggerated. Yet whispers magnified it into something monstrous. So monstrous, in fact, that aristocrats believed killing him was necessary to save Russia. But even his bizarre assassination, poison, bullets, drowning, was itself twisted into whispers and legend, as though the man were half mortal, half myth. The common thread in all these courts was the fragility of reputation. Royalty lived not only by divine right, but also by image. Once whispers corroded that image, no crown could protect them. Anne Boleyn learned this truth when whispers of adultery doomed her. Marie Antoinette fell victim to whispers of extravagance. Even mighty emperors could not silence rumors of weakness or corruption. And yet, whispers could also protect. Some monarchs cultivated them carefully, using them as shields. Elizabeth I of England allowed whispers about her beauty, her divine favor, her mythical virginity to flourish, shaping an image larger than life. Louis XIV embraced whispers of his godlike majesty, fueling the myth of the Sun King. In these cases, whispers did not destroy, but elevated. Thus, the palace was always a theater where truth and rumor danced together, inseparable. Behind the silken curtains, behind the perfumed halls, power moved not only in decrees and armies, but in the faintest murmur, the softest breath, the whisper that might change the fate of a dynasty. And the question, dear listener, is this: if whispers shaped the past so powerfully, how much of what we think we know is but a shadow, a rumor that refused to die? The deeper one listens, the more unsettling the whispers become. For some were not only about scandal or love affairs, but about the very survival of dynasties. Behind the glitter of crowns, secret pacts and hidden children often determined the course of kingdoms. In Spain, the 16th century produced one of the most notorious whispers, that King Philip II, the champion of Catholicism, orchestrated the death of his own heir, Don Carlos. The young prince, restless and unstable, was rumored to plot against his father. When he was suddenly imprisoned in 1568 and died soon after, whispers surged through Europe. Some claimed Philip ordered poison slipped into his son's cup. Others swore Carlos wasted away in madness. The truth was shrouded, but the whispers branded Philip as a father who murdered his son for power. His enemies seized upon the tale, spreading it as proof that Spain's king was a tyrant cloaked in piety. Similar whispers haunted the Scottish court. James VI, later James I of England, grew up under the shadow of rumor. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, had been accused of conspiring in the murder of her husband, Lord Darnley. The whispers never ceased. Was Mary complicit or merely trapped by ambitious lords? The truth mattered less than the tale, for the whispers justified her forced abdication and James's rise to the throne. Even in his reign, the echo lingered, his legitimacy always faintly stained by the rumor of his mother's guilt. France, too, was full of whispered scandals of illegitimacy. The Bourbon dynasty clung to notions of pure royal blood, yet whispers suggested otherwise. It was said that Henri IV, the so-called good king, sired more bastards than any monarch could count. Some of these children, legitimized by royal decree, wielded power equal to princes. Courtiers whispered whether such influence was dangerous. If the line of succession might someday bend under the weight of too many royal bastards. But the most dangerous whispers were those concerning the hidden hands that ruled behind monarchs. In the Habsburg Empire, ministers like Prince Clemens von Metternich in the 19th century were whispered to be the true masters of Europe, moving emperors like chess pieces. In earlier centuries, whispers claimed it was not kings, but their confessors, the priests who heard their darkest sins, who held the true keys to power. After all, what man is more vulnerable than a monarch on his knees, whispering his soul in the dim light of a chapel? And then there were the darker whispers, the ones never meant to reach daylight. Whispers of secret societies among the nobility, of Freemasons, of Rosicrucians, of hidden councils guiding the fate of kingdoms. Some of these may have been fantasies, exaggerations born of paranoia, but others left trails of letters, symbols, and midnight meetings in candlelit chambers. Ministers feared them, monarchs suspected them, and historians still debate them. Yet whether real or imagined, the whispers of hidden brotherhoods haunted the minds of rulers who feared invisible enemies within their own palaces. It was not armies that most unnerved kings. It was uncertainty. The question of who whispered what, who believed what, who might act upon what. In such uncertainty, paranoia thrived. Monarchs trusted few, for trust could be a death sentence. Indeed, trust itself became a rarity in the courts of Europe. Husbands and wives spied on one another. Brothers turned against brothers, Queens confided in servanteds only to learn their words had been sold for coin. The palace was a hall of mirrors, where loyalty could vanish with the echo of a single murmur. And so, the palace was both the safest and the most dangerous place in the world. A fortress of stone walls, guarded by soldiers, yet fragile as glass when touched by rumor. For a rumor needed no blade, no cannon, no army. It only needed a whisper carried through the air, and the crown could tremble. It is tempting to imagine that only monarchs trembled at whispers, but often it was the courtiers, the glittering men and women orbiting the throne, who lived and died by them. The palace was a stage where rank, wealth, and beauty dazzled the eye, but reputation was the invisible currency, and a reputation could be destroyed in an instant by a whisper murmured at the right ear, in the right moment. Versailles, with its endless mirrors and gardens, was perhaps the most dangerous theater of all. Nobles waited years for an invitation, only to discover that their survival depended not on bravery or lineage, but on how well they could navigate the delicate webs of rumor. A duchess who dared wear a gown too splendid might be whispered about as vain or presumptuous. A duke who failed to bow with sufficient grace could be whispered into disgrace as arrogant. And these whispers were rarely innocent. They were weapons in the hands of rivals. The Marquise de Maintenon, who began life in relative obscurity, rose to be the morganatic wife of Louis XIV through charm, piety, and careful management of whispers, while her rivals spread tales of her humble origins. She countered with whispers of her virtue and devotion to the king. In the end, it was her whispers that proved stronger. Across the Channel, at the English court of the Stuarts, whispers proved no less deadly. King Charles I, rigid in his belief in divine right, never grasped how corrosive rumors could be. His queen, Henrietta Maria, was whispered to be a papist conspirator, scheming with Rome to subvert Protestant England. These whispers fanned flames of distrust until Parliament turned against the king. When civil war erupted, Charles discovered too late that whispers had prepared the ground for rebellion long before muskets fired. But whispers did not always move in shadows. Sometimes they were deliberately staged. At masquerade balls, courtiers concealed behind velvet masks whispered half-truths and slanders, knowing the anonymity protected them. At salons in Paris, sharp-tongued women like Madame de Sévigné turned gossip into an art form, their witty letters spreading whispers faster than any royal decree. These salons, became the crucibles where reputations were forged and destroyed, where the fate of ministers could hinge on the turn of a phrase. There were even times when monarchs themselves stooped to whisper. Elizabeth I, ever the careful strategist, encouraged rumors about her hand in marriage. She allowed whispers of possible unions with foreign princes to circulate, then withdrew, using them as bargaining chips in diplomacy. She whispered promises, then withdrew them again, keeping Europe perpetually off balance. In this sense, she was both the subject and master of whispers, playing the game better than any rival. And yet, whispers were not always confined to scandals of love or politics. They often crossed into the realm of the supernatural. In the courts of Europe, superstition walked hand in hand with power. When sudden deaths struck nobles, whispers of poison spread like wildfire. When plagues swept cities, whispers accused Jews, foreigners, or witches of casting curses. At court, astrologers thrived on whispers, predicting the fates of kings by the stars. Catherine de' Medici kept an astrologer by her side, Nostradamus himself, whose cryptic prophecies fed whispers that she ruled by occult knowledge. In Vienna, Maria Theresa tolerated fortune-tellers at court, despite her Catholic faith, for even she knew how whispers of destiny could comfort or unsettle. Monarchs, for all their majesty, feared the unseen, and whispers of omens often swayed their choices as much as reason. The more one studies these palaces, the clearer it becomes. They were not only places of politics, but echo chambers of fear and desire. Every corridor carried a murmur, every shadow held a secret, and every noble feared that tomorrow's whisper might be their ruin. The court was, in truth, less a home for royalty than a vast and glittering trap. The trap of the court was gilded, yes, but once caught within it, escape was nearly impossible. Nobles who tried to withdraw from intrigue often found that whispers pursued them, even into exile. To be silent was no protection, for silence itself bred rumors. Why has the Count withdrawn? What does he plot in the shadows? What secrets does he hide? In such an atmosphere, even absence spoke. Perhaps nowhere was this more visible than in the tragic story of Anne of Austria, Queen of France, and mother of Louis XIV. For years, she was whispered about in hushed tones, accused of plotting with Spain, accused of adultery with Cardinal Mazarin, accused of treachery against her husband, Louis XIII. Though little evidence supported these claims, the whispers stained her. When the Fronde, a noble rebellion, shook France during her regency, The murmurs of her supposed foreign sympathies gave rebels their rallying cry. To some, she was a mother defending her son. To others, she was a conspirator in her own palace. The truth lay buried, smothered under the noise of rumor. In England, a century later, whispers engulfed another queen, Caroline of Brunswick, estranged wife of George IV. Their marriage was a battlefield of slander. George despised her, and his allies spread whispers of her infidelity and vulgar behavior. Caroline, in turn, became the darling of the opposition press, who whispered of George's extravagance and cruelty. The people cheered her in the streets, while the king was mocked. The monarchy itself was pulled into scandal, and once again whispers proved sharper than law or crown. The weaponization of whisper was not only personal, it was political. States employed rumors as tools of propaganda. In the 30 Years' War, pamphlets flooded Europe, whispering tales of atrocities committed by one side or the other, often exaggerated or fabricated. These whispers shaped alliances, stoked hatred, and prolonged conflict. What began as gossip in taverns or at court could, once printed, become a tide of perception that no army could resist. But just as whispers could weaken monarchs, they could also create myths that fortified them. Consider Frederick the Great of Prussia. Whispers of his brilliance in strategy, his austerity, his philosopher-king persona spread faster than his armies marched. Even his enemies believed the rumors of his genius, and often acted with hesitation as a result. In his case, the whisper of greatness was as valuable as the reality. Yet the line between myth and slander was perilously thin. In Vienna, whispers about Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, painted her as a melancholy beauty, trapped in a cold marriage. Some whispered of secret lovers, others of her obsession with youth and diet. These whispers, half admiring and half cruel, cemented her image as a tragic figure, beloved yet pitied. She herself both despised and cultivated these rumors, knowing that her legend gave her a form of freedom her reality denied. At times, the palace whispers spilled outward, fueling revolution. In the years before 1789, France simmered with stories of the Queen's extravagance, of hidden orgies in Versailles, of diamond necklaces and poisoned plots. Many of these tales were lies, planted by political enemies, yet they spread like fire among the people. When the Bastille fell, it was not only hunger and debt that pushed the mob forward. It was the accumulation of whispers that had turned respect into hatred. This, perhaps, is the greatest irony. kings and queens built palaces to awe, to distance themselves from their people, to radiate untouchable majesty. Yet in the very isolation of those gilded halls, they made themselves vulnerable. The people saw them only through whispers, shadows distorted into monsters or gods. And when the whispers grew too loud, crowns toppled. The question that lingers is haunting. Did any monarch truly rule by divine right, or did they rule only by the fragile grace of whispers? If whispers were fragile, they were also enduring. Centuries after the death of a monarch, the rumors that once haunted their courts still cling like cobwebs to their memory. In truth, history itself has become little more than the collection of whispers that survived. Take Richard III of England, for example. To some, he was a capable king, a reformer betrayed by fate. Yet Shakespeare's play, echoing Tudor whispers, cast him as a deformed villain who murdered his nephews in the Tower of London. Whether he truly ordered their deaths remains uncertain. But the rumor, repeated over and over, hardened into legend. Even when Richard's bones were unearthed beneath a Leicester car park in the 21st century, his crooked spine seemed to vindicate the whispers of deformity, though it proved nothing of his guilt. His reputation, centuries later, is still the prisoner of whispers. Or consider Louis XV of France. Though less flamboyant than his predecessor, he was consumed by whispers of corruption and indulgence. The public whispered of his hidden apartments, filled with mistresses too young for propriety, of fortunes wasted while the people starved. These tales eroded the sacred aura of the monarchy, so that by the time of his grandson, Louis XVI, respect for kingship was already in tatters. It was not only guillotines that destroyed monarchy in France. It was whispers, spread for decades, preparing the blade long before it fell. In Russia, whispers around the Romanovs were more bizarre, more extravagant. They whispered of curses, of hemophilia hidden within the royal bloodline, of Rasputin's unholy influence. When the Bolsheviks stormed their palace, the Romanovs were not just monarchs. They were the characters of dark fairy tales whispered across Europe. And so their murder was not only political, but symbolic. The execution of a legend that whispers had already damned. But perhaps the most intriguing of all are the whispers that never quite die, the ones that leave behind tantalizing questions. Did Queen Elizabeth I bear a secret child, hidden away in some noble household? Did Marie Antoinette really plot with Austria against her adopted homeland? Did the Romanovs escape in some form, with Anastasia slipping into obscurity? These whispers refuse to be silenced, not because they are proven, but because they are irresistible. They are the shadows that history cannot quite banish. What made whispers so dangerous in the courts of Europe was not simply that they could destroy individuals. It was that they could shape entire nations. Rumors of papal corruption fueled the Reformation. Rumors of witchcraft led to trials that consumed villages and noblewomen alike. Rumors of conspiracies, Jesuit plots in England, Masonic intrigues in France, kept monarchs awake at night. And in this way, whispers became the heartbeat of power. They were intangible, yet they moved armies. They were invisible, yet they toppled dynasties. They were soft as breath, yet louder than trumpets in their effect. To walk the corridors of a palace was to live in constant awareness that one was never alone. Every servant could be a spy. Every smile could be a mask. Every silence could conceal a murmur waiting to bloom into a scandal. In that world, survival required more than wealth or title. It required mastery of whispers. For some, like Elizabeth I or Louis XIV, the ability to shape whispers into myths ensured their greatness. For others, like Anne Boleyn, Marie Antoinette, or Charles I, whispers became the chains that dragged them to their deaths. And so we see the pattern. Europe's courts were not merely centers of government. They were arenas where rumor and reality clashed, where the true rulers were not always those who wore crowns, but those who understood the secret language of the whisper. Imagine, for a moment, standing in one of those candlelit corridors. The hush of silk gowns brushing against marble. The flicker of torchlight throwing long shadows. And voices, always voices, humming like bees just beyond earshot. This was the true sound of monarchy, not the trumpet fanfare of coronations, but the low, ceaseless murmur of whispers weaving webs around thrones. Some whispers were born from envy, others from fear, still others from a desire to control. And often they came from the least expected mouths. Servants, for example, wielded extraordinary power. A chambermaid who overheard a queen's confidences could, with a few whispered words, destroy reputations. A valet who noticed too many nocturnal visits to a royal chamber could feed a rumor that reshaped alliances. These lowly figures, invisible in the grand portraits of history, were in truth some of the greatest arbiters of fate. One of the most striking examples comes from the French court of Louis XV. His network of spies, known as the Secret du Roi, relied heavily on whispers collected by servants and minor officials. They carried tales across Europe, often more valuable than treaties. At times, these whispers revealed plots against the crown. At others, they stirred paranoia and mistrust. Yet even the king himself could not escape their dangers. His private liaisons with young women at the Parc aux Cerfs, whispered about in salons, eroded his reputation as a monarch of dignity and replaced it with the image of a libertine unfit to rule. England had its own webs at the Hanoverian court of George II and George III. Factions thrived on whispers. Ministers whispered against one another, competing for royal favor. Aristocratic women became political hostesses, spreading rumors in drawing rooms that carried more weight than parliamentary speeches. The so-called petticoat politicians wielded influence not through law, but through the deft spreading of whispers. To dismiss them as mere gossip was to misunderstand their true role. They were the invisible gears of political machinery. Sometimes, whispers became so entangled with superstition that monarchs acted upon them as though they were truth. The death of a royal child, a sudden storm before a battle, a comet streaking across the sky, all became fodder for whispers of divine favor or wrath. Kings employed astrologers not simply out of curiosity, but because whispers about omens could sway public belief. Better to control the rumor than to be destroyed by it. One of the eeriest tales belongs to the Habsburg court. When Emperor Rudolf II reigned in Prague, whispers painted him as a ruler obsessed with alchemy, astrology, and hidden knowledge. They whispered that he kept sorcerers in his court, that he sought the philosopher's stone, that his chambers were filled with bizarre experiments. True or not, these whispers eroded his authority, turning him into a figure of ridicule, even madness. His empire weakened, not only from external enemies, but from the whispers that cast doubt on his sanity. The more one examines the courts of Europe, the more one sees how whispers blurred the line between reality and myth. A rumor of poison could send nobles avoiding one another's tables. A rumor of infidelity could unravel a royal marriage. A rumor of treason could send a man to the scaffold before evidence was even sought. In this world, whispers were both judge and executioner, and the kings, for all their crowns, were not immune. They too listened in the night, wondering which whispers were true, which false, and which might prove fatal by morning. For the crown was heavy not only with jewels, but with shadows, and every shadow whispered. Perhaps the cruelest feature of whispers was their persistence. Once born, they rarely died, even when disproven, they lingered like smoke after fire, staining the air long after the embers cooled. For the noble families of Europe, this meant that a single scandal, even if false, could echo across generations. Take the House of Medici, once masters of Florence. Their wealth and cunning brought them dukedoms and queenships, yet the whispers of poison never abandoned them. Catherine de' Medici's reputation as a black widow who toyed with potions and sorcery lived on long after her death. Every sudden illness at court, every untimely demise, was laid at her feet in rumor. Centuries later, she is remembered as much for those whispered suspicions as for her genuine political achievements. The Medici, no matter how refined, could never fully wash away the taste of poison in their name. In Spain, the shadow of whispers hung over Joanna of Castile, cruelly remembered as Juana la Loca, Joan the Mad. Was she truly insane, or was her eccentric behavior exaggerated by men eager to strip her of power? Whispers of her madness allowed her father, then her son, to rule in her name. Whether she was merely grieving for her husband or suffering from true illness is still debated. But the whispers of her instability proved stronger than her claim to the throne. A queen was imprisoned for life, not by chains alone, but by whispers. And then there is the case of Marie Antoinette's diamond necklace affair, one of the most spectacular scandals of the 18th century. She had no part in the plot, a fraudulent scheme involving a cardinal and a con woman. But whispers tied her to it immediately. They said she had ordered the necklace to flaunt her extravagance. They said she had conspired with her lover. No defense could compete with the allure of the rumor. When the revolution erupted, these whispers returned with vengeance, painted across pamphlets and shouted in the streets. They helped transform a queen into a villain. Even the mighty Napoleon Bonaparte understood the power of whispers. He once said, "A soldier will fight long and hard for a bit of colored ribbon." But he also knew that soldiers would desert if whispers of defeat spread. He carefully cultivated his image through bulletins, exaggerating victories, downplaying losses, and ensuring that the whispers of his genius traveled faster than the truth of his setbacks. His empire, for a time, stood as much on rumor as on bayonets. But whispers were not only weapons of destruction. Sometimes they created legends of near immortality. Consider Peter the Great of Russia. Whispers of his towering strength, his violent temper, his tireless energy spread through Europe like wildfire. Tales of him working alongside carpenters, of him wrestling giants, of him traveling incognito through Europe, elevated him to near mythic stature. Whether exaggerated or true, these whispers served him well, making allies cautious and subjects reverent. What fascinates us still is not whether these whispers were true, but why they endured. Perhaps because people crave stories more than facts. A cold decree or an official chronicle rarely stirs the imagination, but a whisper laden with mystery and suggestion lodges in memory like a thorn. The courts of Europe thrived on this hunger. They were theaters where appearance was reality, and whispers were the script everyone performed. And in those theaters, survival required more than loyalty or skill. It required learning to hear whispers without being consumed by them. Some nobles mastered this art. Others fell victim. But none, not even the greatest kings or queens, could ever escape them entirely. If one lesson can be drawn from centuries of palace intrigue, it is this. In courts built on spectacle, perception was power. And perception was shaped not by truth alone, but by the whispers that swirled endlessly around the throne. Consider the Stuarts of England, perhaps one of the dynasties most battered by rumor. King James I, though a scholar and patron of learning, was whispered to have unseemly affections for his male favorites. The Duke of Buckingham, young and handsome, was said to hold the king's heart as no minister ever could. Whether these rumors were exaggerated or true, they spread across Protestant Europe, staining James's reputation and weakening the dignity of the monarchy he had inherited. His son, Charles I, suffered worse. When whispers spread that his French Catholic queen, Henrietta Maria, was plotting to re-Catholicize England, distrust festered. Soon, Parliament painted every royal act as part of a whispered conspiracy against Protestantism. By the time civil war broke out, the king was no longer seen as a flawed ruler, but as the centerpiece of a dark and dangerous rumor. His beheading was justified, in part, not by his actions alone, but by the whispers that had magnified them into treason against the nation. Whispers often made foreigners into villains. Queens brought from abroad, Austrian, Spanish, German, were easy targets. Anne of Austria in France, Henrietta Maria in England, Marie Antoinette before the Revolution. All were whispered to be traitors in silken gowns, loyal not to their new kingdoms, but to their homelands. The accusation was convenient, impossible to disprove, and endlessly repeated. It reminded everyone that to marry into a royal house was not to be embraced, but to walk forever under suspicion. Even kings were not spared suspicion about their foreign ties. George I of England, a German who spoke little English, was whispered to keep mistresses in Hanover and to care more for his continental estates than his new realm. His grandson, George III, though dutiful and frugal, was whispered to be mad long before his illness became undeniable. The whispers of his insanity echoed across Europe, turning allies wary and subjects restless. Once again, the rumor proved as fatal to authority as the reality. Sometimes whispers grew so elaborate that they became almost works of art. Pamphlets, caricatures, lampoons that spread across cities like wildfire. In 18th century Paris, scandal sheets known as libelles dripped with lurid tales about the king and queen. They depicted Marie Antoinette as a seductress, a conspirator, even an incestuous mother. These grotesque fictions were devoured by the public, not because they were true, but because they satisfied a hunger for mystery, for scandal, for a glimpse behind the gilded curtains of Versailles. Such pamphlets remind us of something important. Whispers were rarely innocent. They were tools, crafted and wielded by those who sought power. Ministers commissioned them. Rivals paid for them. Disgruntled courtiers fed them. Even foreign powers used them, spreading rumors in enemy courts to destabilize monarchs from within. A whisper was as much a weapon of war as a musket or cannonball. And yet, whispers were also strangely democratic. In an age when commoners could never enter the palace, rumors allowed them to imagine it. A baker in Paris or a cobbler in London might never see a queen, but through whispers he could believe he knew her. Her loves, her vices, her schemes. Whispers tore down the walls of privilege, bringing the mighty down to earth in the imagination of the masses. But for the nobles, trapped within those walls, whispers were chains of gold. They gleamed with possibility, an opportunity to rise, to influence, to destroy a rival. But they also bound, suffocating those who could never escape their reach. For in the palace, there was no such thing as privacy. Every cough, every glance, every absence became fodder for whispers. And whispers, once born, were merciless. In some ways, whispers were the true chronicles of the courts. The official histories praised monarchs. The portraits immortalized their dignity, but it was whispers that told the stories people remembered. They thrived in corridors and salons, in candlelit antechambers and smoky taverns, where truth and invention mingled until no one could separate them. At Versailles, the ritual of the levee, the king's daily rising, was a theater not only of etiquette, but of rumor. Courtiers jostled for position, not merely to be seen, but to be seen whispering. A glance exchanged with the monarch could be exaggerated into a sign of favor. A missed invitation could become proof of disgrace. The smallest gestures, magnified by whispers, became powerful signals read across Europe's noble networks. In truth, many decisions of state were less influential than the murmurs about who had been handed the royal nightshirt or who had been dismissed from the chamber too soon. The same pattern unfolded in Vienna, Madrid, London, and St. Petersburg. Palaces were not simply residences. They were echo chambers, amplifying every sound into a possible intrigue. Consider Empress Maria Theresa of Austria. By many measures, she was one of Europe's most capable monarchs, resilient, pragmatic, and deeply maternal. Yet even she could not avoid whispers. Her decision to marry her daughter, Marie Antoinette, to the French Dauphin was whispered to be part of a sinister Austrian plan to dominate France. These rumors would later haunt her daughter's reign, shaping public opinion long before the revolution gave those whispers a chance to roar. Or look to the Russian court of Catherine the Great. She was whispered to have staged her husband's overthrow and death, which, in truth, may not have been far from reality. But it was the more salacious whispers, absurd and grotesque, that followed her beyond the grave. Tales of shocking lovers, even scandalous rumors too vile to repeat in polite company. They were not true, yet they clung to her memory with more persistence than her reforms, her victories, her brilliance. Whispers could immortalize not accomplishments, but scandals, real or imagined. In Britain, Queen Victoria's long reign was not without its share of whispers. After the death of her beloved Prince Albert, rumors swirled of her attachment to her Scottish servant, John Brown. Was it friendship, dependence, or something more? The whispers were enough to tarnish the image of a grieving widow with suggestions of impropriety. Even her great-grandson, Edward VIII, would later fall victim to whispers. His love for Wallis Simpson, whispered long before it was publicly acknowledged, eventually forced him from the throne. Whispers worked with such power because they tapped into curiosity about the private lives of the mighty. People believed, or wanted to believe, that kings and queens, despite their crowns, were bound by the same vices, desires, and weaknesses as everyone else. A whisper of corruption, of passion, of cruelty made them human, but also stripped them of divinity. And once divinity was lost, monarchy itself stood on trembling ground. For centuries, whispers eroded the sacred aura of kingship more effectively than revolts or armies. Armies might be defeated, rebellions might be crushed, but once whispers convinced the people that their ruler was unworthy, the crown became a hollow ornament. In that sense, the whispers of Europe's courts were not merely entertainment or scandal. They were the quiet architects of history, the unseen hands shaping revolutions, reforms, and downfalls. And they remind us, even now, that behind the grandeur of palaces and the splendor of thrones, power is often no louder than a whisper. There is a peculiar irony in how whispers worked. The more secretive the court tried to be, the more fertile the ground for rumor became. Opacity bred imagination. When people were shut out from the truth, they filled the silence with whispers, often darker than reality. The Spanish court under the Habsburgs illustrates this well. King Philip II, withdrawn and austere, conducted affairs of state behind closed doors. To his subjects, this secrecy transformed him into something spectral. They whispered that he held audiences at midnight with sorcerers, that he poisoned rivals, that he kept forbidden books in his chambers. He became the Black Legend of Spain, less a man than the sum of shadows cast by whispers. Contrast this with Louis XIV, the Sun King of France, who did the opposite. He performed his daily life in public, turning even the most mundane rituals into ceremonies. He understood that by letting the court see him, he controlled the whispers. Instead of imagining scandals, courtiers busied themselves competing for the honor of passing him a shirt. By living in a gilded fishbowl, Louis dulled the edge of rumor. It was a brilliant strategy, though even he could not prevent whispers about mistresses, secret paternity, or the hidden costs of his extravagance. Sometimes, whispers were deliberately seeded by monarchs themselves. Elizabeth I of England, the Virgin Queen, allowed whispers of possible marriages to circle endlessly. Suitors from Spain, France, and within her own kingdom were toyed with by the possibility. She never married, but the whispers of her potential alliances were more valuable than the reality would have been. They kept foreign powers guessing, kept courtiers eager, and preserved her independence. She ruled as much through rumor as through decree. But whispers could also spiral out of a monarch's control. The infamous Affair of the Poisons in France is one such tale. In the late 17th century, whispers of witches, poisoners, and black masses spread through Paris and reached into Versailles itself. Nobles were accused of buying potions and powders to eliminate rivals or win forbidden loves. Even Madame de Montespan, Louis XIV's powerful mistress, was whispered to have dabbled in dark rites. The king, terrified that whispers could taint his glory, ordered brutal investigations. Dozens were executed, but the damage was done. The whispers left a stain that no executions could erase. In Austria, another dangerous whisper once circulated about the Empress Elizabeth, better known as Sisi. Beautiful, melancholic, and reclusive, she inspired endless speculation. Whispers claimed she starved herself to preserve her slender figure, that she wandered the halls like a ghost, that she sought escape in affairs abroad. While her tragedy was real, her alienation, her sorrow, the whispers amplified it, making her less a woman and more a myth. In death, she became a romantic specter, remembered not for politics, but for whispers of beauty and sadness. What becomes clear is that whispers were not accidents. They were currency. They were weapons. They were entertainment. They were the very breath of the palace. And they remind us that truth in the courts of Europe was often the least valued commodity. Appearance mattered, performance mattered, and whispers mattered most of all. To study the nobility and royalty of the past, then, is not only to look at battles and treaties, but to listen, to lean in close to the murmurs in candlelit halls, to the rumors exchanged in gardens, to the secrets carried by servants through keyholes and corridors. For history was not written in silence. It was whispered. And so, the palace itself became an organism of whispers, its walls alive with secrets that clung to every curtain and tapestry. To enter those chambers was to step into a labyrinth where every passageway echoed with intrigue, where power was never spoken directly, but passed in hushed confidences. Sometimes a whisper began as nothing more than idle curiosity. A lady in waiting saw the queen pause too long with a certain gentleman. A servant noticed the king's physician leaving chambers at an unusual hour. Small observations, passed in jest or speculation, could grow monstrous in retelling. By the time they reached the salons of Paris or the coffee houses of London, they were no longer suggestions, but certainties, tales that could wound reputations beyond repair. The salons themselves were engines of rumor. In 18th century France, noblewomen hosted glittering gatherings where philosophers, politicians, and courtiers mingled. There, whispers were polished into stories, embroidered with wit, sharpened with satire. A rumor, born in a servant's quarters, could, by evening, be dressed in elegance and quoted as truth in the salon of Madame Geoffrin or Madame du Deffand. From there, it leapt into pamphlets and plays until all Paris repeated it. In London, coffee houses played a similar role. Cheap, smoky, and crowded, they were called penny universities for the conversations they hosted. Here, merchants, journalists, and minor officials swapped tales of the nobility. The smallest whisper could grow into a print scandal sheet by morning, sold on street corners for pennies. Nobles, despite their aloofness, could not stop their names from being dragged into these bustling arenas of gossip. And then there were the whispers that came from beyond Europe's borders. Ambassadors were some of the greatest spreaders of rumor, for their reports mixed intelligence with speculation. Venetian ambassadors in particular were notorious for their detailed, and often scandalous, dispatches. They reported not only on policy, but on who shared a monarch's bed, who had fallen into disgrace, who was rumored to be plotting. These reports, preserved in archives, read today like catalogues of whispers, the pulse of courts recorded through hearsay. Sometimes, monarchs themselves leaned eagerly into whispers, using them as tools of control. Peter the Great allowed tales of his ferocity to spread, encouraging the idea that he could kill with a glance or drink an entire barrel of vodka in a sitting. Whether true or not, such whispers magnified his authority. Likewise, Frederick the Great of Prussia encouraged whispers of his military genius, ensuring that even before a battle was fought, enemies trembled at his reputation. But whispers could just as easily unravel such carefully woven images. In Spain, whispers that King Charles II was cursed because of generations of inbreeding eroded faith in his rule. His physical ailments and childlessness were explained not as misfortune, but as proof of sorcery or divine punishment. Ministers schemed not only against one another, but against the shadowy curse that whispers had conjured. When he died without an heir, the War of Spanish Succession seemed almost a fulfillment of prophecy whispered for decades. In the end, whispers were both the stage and the script of Europe's nobility. They were stories constantly retold, reshaped, and repurposed, never resting, always moving. No decree could silence them. No sword could cut them down. No crown could shield against them. They were as much a part of monarchy as jewels, palaces, or thrones. And if one listens closely, leaning into the long corridors of history, those whispers are still there, haunting, insistent, carrying with them the secrets of the past. Even today, when we walk through the grand palaces of Europe, there is a sense that the stones themselves remember. Versailles, Schönbrunn, Hampton Court, El Escorial. Each of them feels heavy, not only with history, but with the weight of secrets never spoken aloud, only whispered. At Hampton Court, for instance, visitors still tell of Anne Boleyn's ghost gliding through the halls, her silent figure a reminder of how whispers destroyed her. She was accused of adultery, incest, witchcraft, charges born more of political necessity than fact. Yet the whispers were enough to seal her fate. Henry VIII may have signed her death warrant, but it was the soft murmur of rumor that had already condemned her long before the blade fell. Versailles, in turn, remains haunted by its own echoes. In the Hall of Mirrors, where ambassadors once bowed before Louis XIV, the walls once carried whispers of who was rising and who was falling from favor. The same halls that glittered with sunlight and chandeliers also resounded with secret meetings, stolen glances, and rumors of poison. Today, tourists admire the grandeur, but beneath the gold and glass lies the memory of a world where a single whisper could change a life overnight. In Vienna, the Hofburg Palace sheltered centuries of Habsburg secrets. Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, still fascinates because of the whispers that surrounded her in life. Her obsessive beauty rituals, her melancholy, her escape into poetry and travel, all were whispered about endlessly, turning her into both an idol and a mystery. It is no wonder that visitors still leave flowers at her statue, as if paying homage not to the empress she was, but to the whispers that shaped her legend. Whispers were not confined to the mighty alone. They trickled down, shaping how entire nations understood their rulers. A farmer in rural France, a merchant in Amsterdam, a sailor in Lisbon. None would ever set foot in a palace, but all would know its stories. They would repeat the rumors of queens who betrayed their husbands, of kings who consorted with demons, of princes who plotted in shadows. These tales were carried in songs, in tavern jokes, in sermons. Whispers made monarchy human, but also fallible. Sometimes, whispers offered comfort. In Russia, peasants whispered that the true Tsar still lived, hidden somewhere, ready to return and deliver them from suffering. When impostors claimed to be long-dead princes, like the false Dimitris, they were embraced, not because people believed in their identity, but because they believed in the whispers that said salvation might yet come. Other times, whispers spread fear. In plague years, nobles were accused of poisoning wells. In famine years, queens were whispered to hoard bread while children starved. These rumors, born of desperation, turned into fury that threatened to consume entire dynasties. Looking back, one sees how fragile monarchy truly was. The crown was not only threatened by armies and revolts, but by the invisible power of the spoken word. Whispers were the soft rebellion of the powerless, the invisible arrows of rivals, the hidden storm that could topple a throne. And perhaps that is the greatest mystery of all, that in an age of grandeur, of marble palaces and jeweled crowns, it was not the roar of cannons or the clash of swords that most often determined the fate of kings and queens. It was whispers, soft as breath, carrying secrets that history still strains to hear. The deeper we listen, the more we realize that whispers were not only about scandal, they were about survival. In a world where trust was dangerous, whispers were the currency by which lives and fortunes were bargained. For courtiers, whispers were ladders. A rumor whispered into the right ear could ruin a rival and clear the way to royal favor. A half-truth shared at a banquet could spark suspicion that led to exile or even execution. Careers were made and unmade in this invisible economy. The ambitious learned not only how to whisper, but when to hold silence, when to feign ignorance, when to let others destroy themselves with their own tongues. But for monarchs, whispers were chains. Every gesture was watched, every sigh interpreted, every absence magnified. When Louis XVI hesitated to act decisively in the early days of the French Revolution, whispers painted him as cowardly, indecisive, weak. When he tried to flee Paris in disguise, whispers twisted it into treason. Before long, the monarchy itself was not a pillar, but a crumbling edifice, eaten away by rumors that carried more force than law. Even in moments of triumph, whispers remained. After Elizabeth I defeated the Spanish Armada, whispers spread that it was not her strategy, but storms sent by God that saved England. Her great victory was diminished by murmurs that credited providence rather than policy. She responded shrewdly, embracing the whispers of divine favor, weaving them into her image as God's chosen queen. Here lies the paradox. Those who survived whispers best were those who learned to bend them, to use them, to weave rumor into myth. In some courts, whispers became almost ritualized. The Venetian Council of Ten, famed for its secrecy, placed locked boxes, boccia di leone, throughout the city where citizens could drop anonymous denunciations. A whisper written on paper could destroy a man overnight. Venice thrived on these murmurs, turning them into tools of governance. The Republic endured for centuries, in part because it understood the terrible efficiency of whispers. But whispers also birthed conspiracies that outlived their time. The Popish plot in 17th century England was little more than a fabrication by Titus Oates, who whispered that Catholics were plotting to assassinate Charles II. His lies ignited hysteria. Innocent men were executed, and Parliament nearly collapsed under suspicion. Even when his perjury was exposed, the whispers he had unleashed could not be fully undone. They had already poisoned trust, reshaped politics, and left scars on the nation's memory. Some whispers were so intoxicating that people clung to them despite evidence. The myth of Anastasia, the Romanov princess who supposedly survived the massacre of her family, endured for decades. Women across Europe claimed to be her, and people wanted to believe them because the whisper of survival was more compelling than the truth of death. Such is the power of whispers. They offer hope as well as ruin. The nobility of Europe lived in fear of armies, assassins, and revolts. But perhaps their greatest fear of all was this: that they might one day become a whisper themselves. Their name carried in hushed tones, not as rulers, but as scandals. Their legacy reduced to rumor. For in the palace, nothing was more lasting than a whisper. And yet, for all their danger, whispers carried a strange allure. They gave life to the unseen world of the palace, where official proclamations were dull, but secrets glimmered with promise. The people beyond the palace gates hungered for them, for whispers allowed commoners to feel that they too had peered behind the velvet curtains, that they too shared in the forbidden intimacy of royalty. Take, for instance, the whispers that swirled around Mary, Queen of Scots. Her beauty, her marriages, her tragic downfall, all were embroidered by rumor until she seemed less a queen than a heroine of some Gothic romance. They whispered that she conspired in her husband's murder, that she plotted with foreign powers, that she lured men with fatal charms. Whether true or false hardly mattered. By the time Elizabeth I ordered her execution, Mary had already become a creature of whispers, her name spoken with a mixture of pity, desire, and dread. Across Europe, whispers often turned monarchs into something more than human. Monsters, saints, sorcerers. Vlad III of Wallachia, remembered as Dracula, was whispered to impale entire armies and drink blood. Whether exaggerated or not, the whispers carried further than the truth of his campaigns, shaping his memory into legend. To his enemies, he was a demon. To his people, a ruthless protector. Such was the double-edged nature of whispers. They could destroy, but they could also immortalize. In France, the death of Louis XVII, the child king imprisoned during the Revolution, became another whisper that refused to die. Officially, he perished in captivity. Yet for decades, whispers claimed he had escaped, spirited away to safety, hidden by loyalists. Pretenders emerged, each fueled by rumor, each demanding recognition. Even in absence, a whisper could keep a monarchy alive or haunt it like a ghost. At times, whispers blended so deeply with superstition that they shaped policy itself. When comets blazed across the sky, whispers foretold the deaths of kings. The appearance of Halley's comet in 1066 was whispered to herald the Norman conquest of England. Centuries later, in 1682, its return stirred fear at the court of Louis XIV. Though he remained on his throne, the whispers unsettled even the most confident monarchs, for they knew too well that perception was reality. A king who seemed cursed was a king already weakened. What whispers truly reveal is the fragility of power. Crowns were heavy, not with gold, but with expectation. And a single rumor could fracture the illusion of majesty. Kings and queens sought to command armies, to levy taxes, to issue decrees. But none of these could silence a whisper. And still, they tried. They censored pamphlets, executed libelers, banished scandal-mongers. Yet every attempt to silence whispers only made them grow. Suppression gave them the sheen of forbidden truth. To deny a rumor was often to confirm it. And so, the nobility lived in a paradox. They could not acknowledge whispers, yet they could never escape them. It is no wonder, then, that palaces, those symbols of absolute power, so often became theaters of paranoia. Within gilded walls, among marble statues and painted ceilings, men and women walked carefully, smiled cautiously, and spoke with measured care, knowing that their words might become whispers before the day was done. For in the courts of Europe, the true sovereign was not always the one who wore the crown. More often, it was the whisper that ruled. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that whispers were rarely neutral. They carried intent, malice, envy, ambition, or sometimes desperate hope. To whisper was to wield power without bearing responsibility, to strike without drawing a sword. In Florence, the Medici learned this early. Their wealth made them kings in all but name, yet it also made them targets. Whispers of devilry, of pacts with sorcerers, of poisoned rings and enchanted powders clung to their dynasty. Even when they ruled as popes or queens, the shadow of these rumors followed. Catherine de' Medici, though shrewd and pragmatic, was branded the Serpent Queen, whispered to have orchestrated massacres and conjured spirits in hidden chambers. Whether or not she deserved such titles, they became her truth in the minds of her enemies. The same weapon was turned against women in nearly every court. Queens, consort, and favorites were especially vulnerable, for whispers could strip them of dignity faster than any decree. Anne Boleyn was whispered to be a seductress, a witch who ensnared Henry VIII with her dark eyes. Marie Antoinette was whispered to be a foreign traitor, a frivolous libertine who squandered France's wealth on jewels and pleasures. In Spain, whispers painted Queen Isabel II as shameless, her private life dissected with venom. Such rumors were rarely born of fact, but of the deep unease that powerful women stirred in patriarchal courts. Yet sometimes women turned whispers into armor. Elizabeth I embraced the rumors of her unattainable chastity, transforming whispers of her virginity into a mythic identity that served her reign. Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV, knew that whispers of her influence could not be erased. Instead, she cultivated them, shaping herself into a patroness of the arts and a diplomat in her own right. She used the very gossip meant to destroy her as proof of her importance. For men, too, whispers could be double-edged. A king whispered to be weak or sickly, lost the aura of majesty. One whispered to be cruel, gained fear, but lost love. Charles II of Spain, frail and deformed, was whispered to be bewitched from birth, incapable of producing heirs. His reign ended with the collapse of a dynasty, shaped as much by rumor as by fact. Ivan the Terrible of Russia, on the other hand, let whispers of his savagery spread unchecked, believing they magnified his power. Yet even his terror could not protect him from the paranoia those same whispers stoked, leaving him isolated and haunted. Whispers also blurred the line between religion and politics. In Protestant England, rumors of Catholic plots persisted for generations, each one fueling laws, trials, and executions. Jesuits were whispered to lurk in every shadow. Queens were whispered to plot with Rome. In Catholic courts, Protestants were whispered to conspire with devils, to undermine the true faith. These whispers, though unfounded, hardened into policy, leaving trails of blood across Europe. And perhaps this is why whispers still fascinate us today. They remind us that power is never as solid as marble, never as permanent as crowns. It is fragile, shifting, made and unmade in the quiet exchanges of words carried on breath. To study the courts of Europe, then, is to study not only kings and battles, but the invisible threads of rumor that bound them all together. For if history is a tapestry, whispers are the stitches no one sees. Yet without them, the whole would unravel. The endurance of whispers is perhaps their most haunting trait. Facts fade, documents are lost, monuments crumble, but whispers linger, passed from one generation to the next, reshaped with every telling. In time, they become indistinguishable from legend, and legends in turn shape the way we remember entire dynasties. Consider the Plantagenets. King John of England, though a flawed monarch, is remembered less for his policies than for the whispers that cast him as cruel and treacherous. Chroniclers described him as cowardly, lustful, even demonic. Centuries later, Shakespeare's plays preserved those whispers in drama, ensuring that John's name lived forever in infamy. Whether fair or not, his legacy was determined not by laws signed or wars fought, but by the whispers that survived. The Bourbons of France fared no better. Louis XVI may have been indecisive, but it was the whispers that destroyed him. Pamphlets accused him of impotence, of secret plot, of betraying his people. His queen, Marie Antoinette, became the subject of the most obscene rumors imaginable. By the time they stood before the guillotine, they were not rulers, but caricatures, already condemned by whispers that had long since replaced truth in the public mind. In Russia, whispers outlived the monarchy itself. The Romanovs, executed in a cellar in 1918, were swallowed by rumor almost immediately. Some said Anastasia lived. Others whispered of heirs smuggled abroad. These tales persisted for decades, feeding impostors, novels, films, and hope. To this day, the Romanovs remain cloaked in whispers more than in history. Their tragedy transformed into a story without end. Even monarchs who sought to control their narrative found themselves entangled. Napoleon carefully crafted bulletins to glorify his victories and obscure his defeats. Yet whispers followed him regardless. Whispers that he was short, though he was not, that he was a tyrant, that he was fated by destiny. These murmurs outlived his empire, becoming inseparable from his earth. Whispers were also the bridge between the private and the political. In every court, the personal lives of monarchs were dissected not only out of curiosity, but because they were seen as reflections of the state. A queen's rumored affair could be read as national betrayal. A king's supposed weakness in the bedchamber could become a metaphor for weakness on the battlefield. The line between bedroom and battlefield was thin, and whispers made it vanish altogether. The danger lay in their invisibility. A plot could be uncovered, a rebellion crushed, but a whisper could not be seized or silenced. It traveled in breath, in glances, in ink smuggled through hidden presses. It was everywhere and nowhere, impossible to pin down. To fight a whisper was to fight the air. And so, nobles and monarchs alike learned to live in its presence, as one lives with a shadow. Some ignored it, hoping it would fade. Others fed it, turning it to their advantage. Still others were consumed by it, pacing sleepless halls, wondering which whisper would be the one to end them. Perhaps this is why, even centuries later, the stories of palaces still captivate us. The marble and gold remain, but beneath them we sense the faint murmur of voices, the same whispers that once shaped crowns, toppled thrones, and rewrote history itself. If whispers were the lifeblood of the court, then silence was its weapon. For every rumor shouted in a salon, there were secrets never spoken, guarded so carefully that only fragments reached the world beyond. It was in that silence that the most dangerous whispers were born. One need only look at the fall of the Templars. Though not a royal house, they were entwined with monarchy, their fortunes tied to kings and popes. When Philip IV of France sought their destruction, he did not attack with armies alone. He unleashed whispers. He whispered of heresy, of secret rites, of unnatural practices. Few had seen such things, but the silence of the Templars, their refusal to reveal their rituals, made the rumors irresistible. In the end, whispers burned them at the stake. This tactic repeated itself across courts. Silence was filled by imagination, and imagination was always darker than truth. When a royal withdrew from public life, whispers of madness, corruption, or sin took hold. King George III's bouts of illness, for instance, were whispered about long before his condition was understood. His silence, his absence, was enough to convince people he had lost his mind. Whether he had or not mattered little. The whisper became the reality. At times, monarchs played into silence deliberately. The Habsburgs of Spain and Austria cultivated an air of aloofness, cloaking themselves in mystery. But this distance, too, bred whispers. People speculated about deformities, curses, hidden scandals. Charles II of Spain, frail and childless, became the embodiment of these rumors. A monarch whose very body was said to be proof of divine punishment for generations of incestuous unions. The truth may have been tragic genetics, but whispers transformed him into a symbol of decay. By the time he died, His kingdom was already fractured, his dynasty doomed, not only by politics, but by the corrosive effect of whispers that cast him as cursed. Even death itself was not safe from rumor. When rulers died suddenly, whispers of poison inevitably followed. The death of Tsar Alexander I of Russia in 1825 sparked whispers that he had not died at all, but had faked his death to live as a hermit monk. For decades, sightings were whispered across Russia, transforming him into a ghost king who lingered long after his reign ended. In France, the sudden death of Napoleon's heir, the Duke of Reichstadt, was likewise whispered to be foul play, feeding suspicions that enemies of the Bonaparte line had struck again. These posthumous whispers served a purpose. They gave people a way to explain the inexplicable, to hold on to lost leaders, or to justify hatred against their enemies. And in doing so, they blurred the boundary between history and legend. What emerges from all of this is a chilling realization. Monarchs and nobles, for all their crowns and armies, were prisoners of perception. Their power rested not on truth, but on what was believed. And belief was built not by proclamations or decrees, but by whispers, those fragile, fleeting, indestructible murmurs that lived in every court, every street, every tavern. It is no wonder, then, that when we study the courts of Europe, we find not only chronicles of law and war, but echoes, soft, persistent, seductive echoes that tell us what people really thought, what they truly feared, and what they longed to believe. And in those echoes, history itself whispers back. By now, you may feel that whispers were like smoke, curling through the palace halls, impossible to grasp, yet suffocating all the same. But what made them so enduring was their ability to change form. A whisper began as a murmur at supper, then slipped into letters, then hardened into pamphlets, then finally became truth when chroniclers set pen to parchment. What started as gossip could, within a generation, become history. This transformation can be seen in the Tudors. Henry VIII's break with Rome is often told as a tale of political necessity, of dynastic survival. Yet beneath that official story lies a forest of whispers. That Anne Boleyn bewitched him, that she bore a sixth finger as the mark of a witch, that she laughed as Catherine of Aragon wept. None of these things are supported by fact, but they lived on because whispers demanded explanation for what seemed unthinkable. A king tearing apart Christendom for the sake of love. In that sense, Whispers filled the spaces where reason failed. The Stuarts, too, were devoured by whispers. James II's Catholic sympathies fueled endless speculation that he plotted to reimpose papal tyranny. When his queen gave birth to a son, whispers spread that the child was smuggled into the bedchamber in a warming pan, a changeling meant to secure a Catholic succession. The rumor was absurd, but it stuck, and it helped bring about the glorious revolution. A single whisper, ridiculous in content, but powerful in timing, reshaped the monarchy of England forever. And it was not only monarchs who bore the weight of rumor. Courtiers themselves thrived, or perished, by the force of whispers. Take the Duke of Buckingham, favorite of James I and Charles I. His rise was meteoric, but his intimacy with the kings invited whispers of scandal, of unnatural affections, of corruption. By the time he was assassinated, he was less a man than a figure woven of envy and rumor, hated more for what people believed than for what he had done. Even the most secretive courts could not escape. In Austria, the Habsburg court under Empress Maria Theresa cultivated dignity and restraint. Yet whispers of favoritism, of hidden liaisons, of political betrayals filled the salons of Vienna. Her daughter, Marie Antoinette, carried these whispers with her to France, where they blossomed into a storm that would one day devour her. And then there was Spain, where whispers about the Inquisition terrified even kings. Rumors of hidden heresy, of secret Jews, of plots within the palace itself, created a culture of fear. Whispers did not need to be true to ruin reputations. They only needed to be spoken. A noble accused of conversing with forbidden books might never be proven guilty. But the whisper alone was enough to end his career. In all of this, one lesson emerges. Whispers were never just idle words. They were weapons. They were chains. They were shadows cast across golden thrones. And though centuries have passed, though the courts of Europe have become museums rather than seats of power, the whispers have not faded. They still cling to the tapestries, to the portraits, to the echoing halls. When we walk through Versailles or Hampton Court, when we gaze at the portraits in the Prado or the Hermitage, we sense them still. The murmurs of envy, of scandal, of secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. That is the true legacy of nobility and royalty in Europe. Not only their crowns, their wars, their palaces, but the whispers that outlived them all. Imagine, then, the ordinary people who gathered outside palace walls. They could not see the banquets or the councils, but they heard the whispers carried on servants' tongues, on merchants' gossip, on pamphlets sold in shadowed corners. To them, whispers were a kind of truth more compelling than decrees. A proclamation might say the king was just, but a whisper told them he was cruel. Which do you think they believed? It was these murmurs, circulating through taverns and marketplaces, that often turned discontent into rebellion. Before the French Revolution, whispers told of Marie Antoinette bathing in milk while children starved, of jewels bought in secret, of midnight orgies at Versailles. None of these were proven, but all were repeated, embroidered, believed. By the time revolution came, the Queen was already guilty in the eyes of the people, not because of evidence, but because of whispers. Nor was France alone. In England, before the Civil War, whispers painted Charles I as a tyrant, his queen as a papist conspirator. In whispers, they were already condemned long before the axe fell at Whitehall. The same pattern echoed in Russia, where whispers about Rasputin's debauchery spread like fire. Whether he was truly as corrupt as the stories claimed mattered less than the fact that people believed he had bewitched the Romanovs. The dynasty fell, but the whispers endured, stronger than bullets. Courts tried to fight back with spectacle. Kings staged elaborate processions. Queens dazzled in gowns of gold. Palaces gleamed with candlelight, meant to overwhelm rumor with majesty. But whispers slipped through the cracks of splendor. A noble might smile at a mask while secretly murmuring to his neighbor that the king looked pale, or that the queen seemed too friendly with a favorite. These small remarks, multiplied and passed along, eroded the grand image faster than any cannon. What made whispers so irresistible was their intimacy. They promised forbidden knowledge, the feeling of being in the know. To hear a whisper was to share in something private, dangerous, delicious. And so people repeated them, not because they believed them fully, but because repeating them gave a taste of power. Even peasants with no crowns or titles could wield whispers like daggers. It is no surprise that secret police forces rose in so many monarchies. In France, in Russia, in Prussia, rulers sent agents into salons and taverns to catch whispers before they grew too strong. But even this surveillance could not kill them. If anything, it proved how dangerous whispers were, that kings feared words more than swords. And perhaps this is the greatest irony. Monarchs built palaces of stone, armies of iron, treasuries of gold, yet they were undone by breath. A single whispered phrase passed from mouth to mouth, carried more force than all the proclamations ever read from a balcony. This is why, when we look back on the courts of Europe, we must look not only at what was said officially, but at what was whispered. For in those murmurs, half heard and half believed, lies the true story of power, the story of how thrones stood, how they trembled, and how, so often, they fell. There is another side to whispers, more insidious still, the way they intertwined with superstition and the unseen. In ages when plague swept cities and comets scarred the heavens, people looked for explanations. Whispers supplied them, weaving the fates of kings and nobles into omens and curses. When the Black Death ravaged Europe, it was whispered that rulers had angered God, that their sins invited divine punishment. Nobles fell ill alongside peasants, and whispers spread that their wealth could not protect them. Some even whispered of secret rituals, of courts dabbling in alchemy or witchcraft to preserve their lives at the expense of others. Whether true or not, these murmurs deepened resentment and suspicion. Monarchs sometimes leaned into these whispers, turning them to advantage. In the courts of the Holy Roman Empire, emperors were whispered to possess talismans, relics, even the mandilion of Christ. The aura of sacred mystery bolstered their power, binding faith and rule together. In other cases, whispers became dangerous burdens. Rudolph II of Prague, fascinated by alchemy and the occult, surrounded himself with astrologers and magicians. Whispers painted him as unhinged, obsessed with shadows rather than governance. His reign unraveled not only from political failures, but from the rumors that cast him as more sorcerer than sovereign. Whispers could also fuel bloodshed. In the 16th century, as tensions between Catholics and Protestants boiled, rumors of secret plots spread like wildfire. On the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day massacre in France, whispers of Huguenot conspiracies gave license to slaughter. It was said that even Catherine de' Medici's hand was guided not by policy, but by the insidious whispers of plots whispered in her ear. Truth or lie mattered little. The damage was done. The 30 Years' War, one of the most devastating conflicts in European history, was seeded in part by whispers. A letter here, a rumor there, of alliances formed in secret, of treacheries whispered in court. Armies marched, cities burned, and millions died, all while whispers continued to shape the motives and fears of kings who trusted no one. And still, whispers could be strangely protective. In Poland, whispers of the miraculous Black Madonna of Częstochowa inspired nobles and peasants alike, bolstering the kingdom against foreign invasions. In England, whispers of Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen shielded her from the criticisms faced by her married counterparts. rumors could both curse and sanctify, often in the same breath. To walk the corridors of a palace was to walk among these invisible forces, where rumor and superstition ruled as surely as law. The flicker of a candle, the hushed conversation in a gallery, the rustle of a letter hidden in a sleeve, all could carry a whisper that might topple a throne. And this is why the history of nobility and royalty is never only about battles and treaties. It is about what people believed, what they feared, what they whispered in the shadows when the music of the court had faded and the masks were set aside. The truth of Europe's past is not written only in chronicles. It lingers in whispers still, waiting for us to listen. Step closer, and the whispers grow darker still. Those that spoke not only of scandal, but of murder, cloaked in velvet. For in courts where daggers were too crude, poison was the weapon of choice, and whispers its constant companion. In Renaissance Italy, the Borgia name became synonymous with such rumors. Cesare and Lucrezia were whispered to keep rings filled with venom, to serve wine laced with death. Did they truly poison their rivals? Perhaps. But whispers did not care for proof. They fed on fear, on the very possibility that a smile across the banquet table could mean one's last breath. Long after their dynasty waned, the Borgias remained monsters in rumor, their reputations damned more by whispers than by facts. The Medici, too, were touched by such murmurings. At weddings and feasts, a sudden illness was enough to spark whispers of betrayal. Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France, could never escape the rumors of her apothecary, Ruggieri, and the potions he concocted in hidden chambers. Even when she acted out of necessity, she was whispered to have blood on her hands. Such whispers made her feared, but they also ensured her survival. France itself became fertile ground for this kind of gossip. The affair of the poisons in the 1670s and 80s revealed a hidden world of alchemists, fortune-tellers, and poisoners serving the elite. Whispers of black masses and infant sacrifices reached even the king's mistress, Madame de Montespan. Though no proof condemned her, the whispers alone were enough to tarnish her glory and hasten her fall from favor. Versailles glittered with gold, but beneath the chandeliers, whispers told of shadows darker than night. Even in England, whispers of poison haunted the court. When Prince Arthur, elder brother of Henry VIII, died suddenly, whispers claimed he had been poisoned to clear the way for Henry's ascension. When Anne Boleyn fell, her enemies whispered she had plotted to poison the king himself. Later, when Elizabeth I grew ill, whispers flew that Enemies sought to poison her food. Every banquet, every goblet, every shared dish was touched by suspicion. It was not only poison that whispers clung to, but sorcery. Nobles accused rivals of witchcraft, of curses muttered in candlelit rooms. In Scotland, whispers of magic surrounded James VI, who obsessed over witch trials, convinced that storms raised against his fleet were conjured by spells. Even monarchs were not immune to superstition. Whispers of sorcery could shake thrones as surely as whispers of treason. These stories remind us of something vital. The courts of Europe were not merely theaters of pomp, but crucibles of fear. In the glittering silence of ballrooms, in the hush of tapestried chambers, whispers grew like ivy, creeping, clinging, impossible to uproot. They could never be stopped, only endured. And so the great irony endures. Kings and queens, who held the fate of nations in their hands, were themselves at the mercy of whispers. To live in a palace was to live not among marble and gold, but among shadows that spoke. But whispers did not only live in banquet halls and bedchambers. They seeped into parchment and ink, captured in letters meant never to be read by the wrong eyes. Some of the most damning whispers in history were not spoken aloud, but carried secretly in correspondence, then exposed at the most dangerous moment. Take the case of Mary, Queen of Scots. Her imprisonment in England might have silenced her voice, but her letters kept her dangerous. Whispers of her correspondence with Catholic conspirators, of plots to assassinate Elizabeth I, found their way into the hands of spy master Sir Francis Walsingham. The Babington plot, unveiled through these intercepted letters, sealed her fate. Whether or not the whispers of her guilt were exaggerated, they gave Elizabeth the justification she needed. A queen's life ended not by sword, but by the whispers written in her own hand. Letters also damned Anne Boleyn. During her trial, her supposed words, private remarks, fragments of flirtation, were twisted into treasonous whispers. She was accused of mocking the king's virility, of scheming with courtiers. The whispers of her words, whether true or forged, mattered more than truth itself. Once repeated in court, they became evidence. Once evidence, they became death. The Habsburgs, too, suffered from the power of ink. In the 17th century, when the Spanish court was riddled with factions, nobles leaked letters whispering of incompetence and corruption. These whispers, set down in secret reports, traveled to foreign embassies, shaping diplomacy itself. Alliances rose and fell, not just from treaties, but from the gossip that crossed borders. Sometimes whispers in letters grew into great scandals. The diamond necklace affair of 1785 was fueled by a web of forged correspondence suggesting that Marie Antoinette sought to purchase an extravagant jewel through secret channels. She was innocent, but the whispers carried in those letters destroyed her reputation beyond repair. By the time she stood before her judges, it was not only her actions that condemned her, it was the whispers that had long since painted her guilty in the court of public opinion. And then there were diaries, journals never meant to be read, yet whispered into posterity. Nobles recorded their suspicions, their grievances, their secrets, never knowing these pages would one day spill their whispers into history. The memoirs of courtiers like the Duc de Saint-Simon immortalized gossip of Versailles, turning fleeting murmurs into lasting testimony. His words tell us as much about ambition and intrigue as any royal decree. What strikes us is how fragile truth was in these courts. A letter could be forged, a remark overheard, a diary twisted in its interpretation. But once the whisper was born, it was unstoppable. Even if disproved, it left a shadow, a lingering doubt. And in politics, doubt was often enough to ruin. Thus, whispers were not only spoken in candlelit corridors, they were inked in margins, sealed in wax, hidden in ciphers. And yet they always found a way to escape. Like breath, like smoke, like fate itself, whispers refused to be contained. If whispers thrived in letters and salons, they positively roared in the theaters and pamphlets of Europe. For art itself became a vehicle for rumor, a stage where monarchs and nobles were remade into characters, their reputations twisted for applause or outrage. In London, playwrights cloaked whispers in allegory. Shakespeare's Richard III immortalized the rumor of a hunchbacked tyrant, even though evidence of Richard's deformity was slight. The whisper became drama, and drama became history. For centuries afterward, the English remembered Richard not as he was, but as Shakespeare's villain. Proof that whispers, once given art, outlive all attempts at correction. In France, pamphleteers known as libellistes filled Paris with venom during the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. These cheaply printed sheets whispered of royal debauchery, incest, and conspiracy. Passed hand to hand in taverns and markets, they became the people's truth. The Queen's phrase, "Let them eat cake," was never spoken, but the whisper spread through pamphlets until it was accepted as fact. By the time revolution came, the guillotine was sharpened more by paper than by steel. Music, too, carried whispers. Court composers sometimes slipped sly references into their works, melodies meant to mock rivals or flatter patrons. A tune hummed in a salon could hint at scandal. Even fashion whispered. A new style of hair or dress, mimicking or mocking a royal figure, sent messages as clear as words. Every detail of culture became a channel for whispers. The printing press multiplied this effect beyond imagination. Where once a rumor had to travel ear by ear, now it could be set in type and carried across borders. In the Reformation, Martin Luther's tracts spread not only theology, but whispers of corruption in Rome. The Pope was painted in pamphlets as a glutton, a devil, a whore of Babylon. These whispers, mass-produced, cracked Christendom in two. Courts tried to answer with their own propaganda, hiring poets, painters, and printers to gild their image. But whispers always slipped through the cracks. A portrait meant to show majesty might be whispered about for its stiffness, its awkward eyes. A proclamation of victory might be followed by whispers of a defeat hidden from the people. In this way, whispers became not only private daggers, but public storms. They shaped revolutions, toppled dynasties, and redefined the memory of kings and queens. For once, rumor took root in the imagination of the masses. No army could uproot it. It is striking to realize how modern this feels. Today, information floods across the world in seconds. Yet the principle is the same as it was in Versailles or Whitehall. A whisper, once believed, becomes truth, no matter its source. The courts of Europe were simply the earliest laboratories where this dangerous alchemy was perfected. And so, when we think of nobility and royalty, we must picture not only crowns and jewels, but paper and ink, songs and plays, masks and fashions, all the ways whispers found voice, multiplying until they were louder than kings themselves. By now, the pattern is unmistakable. Whispers shaped not just the image of monarchs, but the very machinery of power. They were the invisible currents beneath every throne, the silent conspirators at every council table. Yet perhaps their most fascinating power lay in the way they traveled, not only across rooms, but across borders. Diplomacy itself was steeped in whispers. Ambassadors, those elegant spies of the courts, dealt in rumor as much as treaties. In their coded dispatches to Madrid, Vienna, or London, they recorded not only official policy, but also the whispers they overheard in salons and corridors. Which noble was falling from favor? Which alliance was cracking? Which royal marriage bed was cold? These reports were prized more than gold, for whispers often revealed truths that no decree would ever admit. Consider the Spanish ambassador in Elizabethan England, who sent home endless whispers about the Queen's suitors, her health, her temperament. Was she truly the Virgin Queen? Would she wed a Catholic prince? Every whisper mattered, for it shaped Spain's strategy. Elizabeth herself knew this and played the game masterfully, feeding whispers to keep her enemies guessing. She wielded rumor like a blade, never marrying, yet always letting the possibility linger. Whispers also traveled with exiles and émigrés. After revolutions or failed plots, nobles who fled carried their tales abroad, whispering in foreign courts of the tyrannies they had suffered, of conspiracies that still smoldered. Some were true, many were lies, but all fed the perception of instability. When the Bourbons were driven from France, they lived on in whispers spread through London and Vienna, keeping alive the dream of restoration. At times, whispers themselves became weapons of war. Before the Spanish Armada set sail in 1588, English agents whispered exaggerated tales of its weakness, sowing doubt before a cannon was even fired. Napoleon, too, used rumor to demoralize enemies, spreading word of his unstoppable armies before they ever appeared on the horizon. Whispers marched ahead of soldiers, softening resistance, shaking faith. Yet these same whispers could betray. Napoleon's own downfall began with rumors of his defeat in Russia, magnified as they spread across Europe. By the time he returned to Paris, the whisper of his invincibility was broken, and with it, the spell of his power. For rulers often discovered that their greatest strength was not armies, but the belief that they could not be beaten. And once that belief was shattered, everything else followed. We see, then, that whispers were not simply idle talk. They were diplomacy's currency, revolution's spark, tyranny's undoing. They were both parasite and host, thriving in palaces, but spilling into streets, shaping nations as surely as battles and treaties. And perhaps this is the true hidden secret of Europe's nobility. Their crowns did not rest on their heads alone, but on the breath of those around them. The moment the whispers turned, the crown grew heavy, unsteady, ready to fall. To listen for whispers, then, is to hear the true heartbeat of history. Step into the long galleries of Versailles, the echoing corridors of the Escorial, or the shadowed halls of the Kremlin, and you will feel it still. The sense that walls themselves once listened. For in these palaces, every footstep, every sigh, every careless remark might be repeated, reshaped, and carried onward. To live there was to live on stage, where even silence became a line in the play. The courtiers who survived longest were those who mastered the art of whispering without speaking. They learned to let a pause linger just long enough to suggest meaning, to let a glance across the chamber imply knowledge they did not possess. Often, the mere suggestion of a secret was more powerful than the secret itself. A noble who seemed to know too much was feared, courted, or eliminated, regardless of whether he truly knew anything at all. This was the essence of intrigue. Power was less about deeds than about perceptions, less about truth than about whispers of truth. And so the palaces of Europe became theaters where rumors were rehearsed as carefully as masks, where scandal was choreographed as neatly as court dances. But what of the rulers themselves? They were not only victims of whispers, they, too, whispered. Catherine the Great spread tales of her rivals' incompetence, feeding stories to foreign diplomats. Louis XIV whispered through intermediaries, planting false rumors to expose disloyalty. Even Elizabeth I, so often targeted, was also a master whisperer, dangling promises of marriage she never intended to fulfill. Kings and queens wielded rumor as both sword and shield, even as they feared its edge. And yet, there was always danger. Whispers, once released, could not be recalled. They took on lives of their own, twisting beyond the control of their makers. Catherine may have mocked her enemies, but whispers about her own private life, outlandish, salacious, cruel, outlived her empire. Elizabeth may have controlled her image, but whispers of her vanity and temper stained her legacy. In this lies the great paradox. Monarchs who could command armies and bend nations to their will could never rule the smallest of things, the human tongue. And so, the hidden history of Europe's nobility is not only of crowns won and lost, but of reputations shaped in shadow. Some survived, some fell, and some became immortal, not for what they did, but for what was whispered about them. Even now, centuries later, we find ourselves repeating these whispers. We retell stories of Anne Boleyn's sixth finger, of Marie Antoinette's cake, of Rasputin's sorcery. We know they are not true, or at least not proven, yet we repeat them, fascinated. For whispers, once born, never die. They echo through time, reshaping history with every retelling. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of all. Power fades, palaces crumble, dynasties vanish, but whispers remain. They are the truest heirs of royalty, the most enduring nobility of all. Think, for a moment, of how these whispers must have felt to those who lived under them. A noblewoman, accused of secret liaisons, would walk through gilded corridors, knowing that every laugh behind a fan might be at her expense. A prince, whispered to be illegitimate, could see loyalty in his subjects' eyes, but wonder, always, if they doubted his blood. A king rumored to be bewitched might find his own courtiers avoiding his gaze, fearful of a curse. The throne was high, but it was never secure. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. Whispers created invisible prisons. A monarch could ride at the head of armies and yet be trapped by the murmurs of his people. Consider poor Charles II of Spain, the last of the Habsburg line. His frail body, twisted by generations of inbreeding, was whispered about more cruelly than any battle he ever fought. El Hechizado, the bewitched, was the name given to him, as though sorcery rather than science explained his condition. The whispers did more than mock. They eroded the legitimacy of his rule. When he died childless, Spain's great empire collapsed into the War of the Spanish Succession, a struggle born as much from whispers of weakness as from dynastic law. Or think of Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi, the tragic beauty. Admired for her grace, she was also whispered about for her melancholy, her obsessions, her distance from court life. To her subjects, she was a fairy tale figure, but within the palace, she was a ghost, haunted by rumors that painted her both fragile and cold. The whispers followed her even in death, turning her assassination into another morbid chapter of her legend. At times, whispers became almost like prophecy. Before the French Revolution, salons buzzed with talk that monarchy itself was doomed, that a storm was coming. These whispers spread faster than decrees, carried not only by nobles, but by writers, pamphleteers, philosophers. By the time the Bastille fell, the idea of revolution had already triumphed in whispers long before it triumphed in reality. And so it is fitting that when monarchs fell, they often left behind not just ruins, but rumors. Was Louis XVII truly dead in his cell? Did Anastasia escape the massacre of the Romanovs? Was Richard III truly the villain Shakespeare painted him to be? These questions endure because whispers are not easily silenced by facts. They linger, feeding imagination, reshaping history into legend. The hidden secret of Europe's nobility is not simply their intrigues, their wars, or their scandals. It is that they were, from first to last, creatures of whispers. Their lives were measured not only in years, but in rumors. Their power was judged not only by crowns, but by breath. And when we lean close to history, we hear those same whispers still. They call to us from palaces, from chronicles, from the shadows of memory. They remind us that power is fragile, that truth is elusive, and that the quietest sound in a palace, the whisper, was often the loudest of all. The more we peel back the layers, the more we see how whispers were not accidents of court life. They were its lifeblood. In fact, entire professions arose around them. Spies, informants, mistresses, confessors, even astrologers, all traded in whispers. Some sold secrets for coin, others whispered for survival, and still others for sheer amusement. But all fed the ever-hungry beast of rumor that thrived in Europe's palaces. Take the figure of the royal confessor. He was meant to be a man of God, yet in his ear flowed the darkest confessions of monarchs and nobles alike. What did he do with them? Many remained loyal to their vows, but others whispered what they heard to factions at court, shaping policy and favor with knowledge stolen from the soul itself. A single whispered penance could be twisted into evidence of weakness, of heresy, of betrayal. Mistresses, too, were more than companions. They were conduits of whispers. The celebrated Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV, wielded power not through armies or titles, but through whispers murmured in the royal bedchamber. She decided which noble was granted audience, which minister rose or fell. Her enemies whispered against her endlessly, accusing her of extravagance, manipulation, witchcraft. But she survived because she controlled the most important whisper of all, the king's ear. Astrologers and soothsayers thrived in this climate as well. Monarchs who publicly dismissed superstition often listened in private. A horoscope whispered into a ruler's chamber could alter decisions of state. Catherine de' Medici surrounded herself with such figures, their cryptic murmurs shaping the fate of France. Skeptics scoffed, but still the whispers carried weight, for who would risk defying a prediction that might be true? Even the servants of great houses played their part. A footman who overheard a quarrel, a maid who glimpsed a hidden letter. Such small whispers could rise up the chain of gossip until they shook the court. Kings feared assassins, but they feared whispers more, because they could never know how far they spread or how much damage they caused before they reached their ears. And here lies the final irony. While whispers seemed like fragile, fleeting things, they proved more enduring than decrees or laws. Monarchs issued edicts. Nobles built castles, but centuries later, we remember them most for the whispers. Henry VIII is recalled not for statutes, but for rumors of lust and cruelty. Marie Antoinette is remembered not for policy, but for whispers of extravagance. Rasputin, the peasant who ensnared the Romanovs, was defined entirely by whispers. Whispers of mysticism, of healing, of corruption, of seduction. History books give us dates and facts, but beneath them lies the true story, the whispered one. And perhaps that is why these tales captivate us still. Because whispers, unlike proclamations, feel alive. They beckon us closer, draw us into the secret, make us complicit in the telling. They are not cold lines of ink. They are breaths in the dark. And so, when we speak of whispers of the court, we are not indulging in idle gossip. We are touching the pulse of history itself, the hidden heartbeat that moved kings and toppled empires. Imagine the palaces at night, when the music of banquets had faded and the candles burned low. This was the true hour of whispers. Servants clearing tables traded murmurs about who had quarreled, who had wept, who had slipped away with whom. Guards at their posts gossiped about secret visitors. Ladies in waiting whispered in shared chambers about the monarch's mood, his health, his latest favor or fury. By dawn, these whispers would spread like smoke, rising from the lowest servants to the highest ministers, often faster than official news. It was in this atmosphere that suspicion became constant. A queen might smile at her maid, yet wonder if she repeated her sighs to an enemy. A minister might trust his secretary, yet fear that every letter he dictated was being copied, every glance noted. Spies did not need disguises. They wore livery and carried trays. The hum of rumor was so constant that one could never tell truth from invention. And in that confusion lay both danger and opportunity. Some rulers embraced this world. Louis XIV, the Sun King, famously built Versailles, not only as a palace, but as a theater where he could watch his nobility. By forcing them to live near him, to compete for trivial honors such as holding his shirt at dressing time, he ensured that their whispers were about each other, not rebellion. Yet even he could not silence them. In the salons of Paris, the philosophes whispered that reason would triumph over monarchy, and their words carried further than the king's commands. Others were undone by whispers. Tsar Nicholas II of Russia ruled a vast empire, yet it was whispers of weakness, of corruption, of Rasputin's influence that destroyed faith in his throne. Even as he tried to project strength, the murmurs grew louder, painting him as blind, inept, ruled by superstition. By the time the revolution came, the whispers had already dethroned him in the minds of his people. And yet, the allure of whispers lay in their ambiguity. They rarely gave certainty. Instead, they suggested, hinted, seduced. A courtier might say, "I heard the king is unwell," leaving the listener to imagine illness, impotence, even death. The whisper was powerful because it invited the imagination to finish the story. And in palaces, imagination was often more dangerous than truth. The legacy of these whispers survives in how we remember history. We speak of Elizabeth I as the Virgin Queen, though it may never have been so. We speak of Marie Antoinette's frivolity, though much of it was fabricated. We speak of Richard III as a villain, though Shakespeare's whisper eclipsed reality. History itself is haunted by whispers, which cling more tightly to memory than fact. Thus, the hidden secret of nobility and royalty is that their greatest battles were not always on fields of war, but in the invisible war of whispers, rumors that could crown or kill, exalt or erase. And that war, though silent, was eternal. There is one more layer to these whispers, the deepest and most unsettling. They did not merely shape reputations, policies, or dynasties. They shaped belief itself. For when enough people whispered the same tale, it became more than rumor. It became truth in the minds of all who heard it. And truth, once established in imagination, was nearly impossible to undo. Take, for example, the legend of the man in the iron mask. A whisper at the court of Louis XIV spoke of a mysterious prisoner, hidden away for decades, his face never seen. Who was he? A disgraced general? A royal twin? The king's illegitimate brother? No record ever revealed the whole truth, yet the whispers endured. Voltaire, Alexandre Dumas, generations of storytellers carried the rumor forward, until the mask itself became more real in memory than the man beneath it. Or consider the Romanovs. Long after their execution in 1918, whispers spread that Anastasia, the youngest daughter, had escaped. Women emerged across Europe claiming to be her. Each whisper, each hopeful sighting, carried with it the weight of a people unwilling to let the dynasty's last light be extinguished. Though history confirmed her fate, the whispers lived on, immortalized in film, in novels, in popular imagination. In England, whispers built entire myths of kings. Richard the Lionheart, absent for most of his reign, was whispered into legend as the perfect crusader. His brother John was whispered into infamy as a tyrant. Centuries later, Robin Hood stories echoed those same whispers, shaping how generations saw their rulers. Fact mattered less than the tale repeated in taverns and sung by minstrels. Even sainthood and damnation could begin as whispers. Joan of Arc, first whispered about as a witch, later became a saint. Templars, once whispered to be heretics, were burned. Yet the whispers of their hidden treasures and forbidden knowledge endure to this day, inspiring seekers of mystery across the world. Perhaps this is the greatest hidden truth of Europe's nobility, that their power was never absolute. It depended not only on armies, wealth, or titles, but on belief. And belief was built from whispers. A monarch was strong only as long as people believed in his strength. A queen was virtuous only as long as whispers painted her so. The moment whispers turned, even the mightiest thrones shook. And so, centuries later, we find ourselves still listening, still repeating. We lean closer to the past, hungry for the secrets it never fully revealed. We know whispers are unreliable, elusive, sometimes cruel, yet we cannot resist them, for in their mystery lies their power. History is not only what happened, it is what was whispered about what happened. That is the final secret of the courts of Europe.